Rich Demillo is the Charlotte B. and Roger C. Warren Chair of Computer Science and Professor of Management at Georgia Tech. He is also the founder of the Century for 21st Century Universities and the author of Revolution in Higher Education, How a Small Band of Innovators Will Make College Accessible and Affordable, and Abrolade to Apple, The Fate of American Colleges. Books that have helped spark national discussion on the future of higher education. He is responsible for educational innovation at Georgia Tech and is a national leader and spokesman on the online revolution in higher education. I just had the great fortune of having breakfast with Rich. He's got a lot of great stories to tell you about what's going on in higher ed today, where the revolution is going. He doesn't mince words, even though he's within the establishment, which I think is terrific. So with that, I'm going to introduce Rich, and we're going to enjoy the next hour.
Thanks, Todd. Thank you, Todd. Good morning, everyone. So, my talk this morning is about a revolution, and I talk about this subject to different audiences. And I find that almost everyone I talk to wants to engage. It's a very different level than this audience, I have to say. When I talk to parents, you can imagine what the concerns are. They're concerned about value, they're concerned about cost, they're concerned about whether or not the push to get their son or daughter into the university of choice is going to be worth it. Students are increasingly involved in this decision. The general public, I find, wants to know what's going on in higher education. This audience is mainly an audience of insiders, so I don't have to do an awful lot about opening the kimono here. What I want to do is give you a framework for helping you make sense out of what's going on in higher education. And I'm going to frame my remarks in terms of technology, in terms of online education. I love the title of this conference, Reimagining. That's what we do. But even for those of us inside, I think this idea of a revolution is somewhat mysterious. And depending on where you are in the ecosystem, you sometimes need help unpacking what's a trend, what's a headline and chronicle of education, what is really likely to happen in the future. You know, for all of us, for parents, students, insiders, the general public, college used to be a simple matter. I went to a private liberal arts college, and I paid the phenomenal annual tuition of $1,500 to do that. And I was perfectly happy to join a collection of other people who paid $1,500 and to sit in lecture halls and absorb the wisdom that was washing over me. That's not the world that we live in today. And so, you know, as you see the many different players, as you see companies like Learning House out there, how do you figure out what this ecosystem is all about? And I guess the easiest way into this subject is to understand that I'm not here to call for a revolution. I read sometimes, when I read reviews at all, I tend to read reviews that I think have sort of gotten the message wrong. And my role is not to call for a revolution. I have two planets that I live on. I'm an insider. I run an organization at Georgia Tech that's an internal think tank. I exist to give my provost and my president headaches on a daily basis. But my president, when he asked me to take on this job, said, I can see that the world is changing. This is a remarkable thing for a president of a top university to say. I can see that the world is changing. Students are changing. Economics of higher education is changing. The politics of education is changing. I would hate to think that 10 years from now, I'm going to look back and see that Georgia Tech couldn't have made all the investment that it should have and missed the large trends. So it's not very often that you get a chance to look out on a generational scale and say, where do we think an institution like Georgia Tech is going to be? Where do we think a public university is going to be? Where do we think an AAU institution is going to be? Where do we think all of the 4,500 or so colleges and universities in the U.S. Are going to be? So one of my points is that although I'm not calling for a revolution, I firmly believe that the paradigm has already shifted. That things that were top of mind to us, and I would bet many of your institutions 5 years ago have simply passed us by, and we've absorbed them, and we've gone on to do other things. We've adopted new language, for example. This idea of a MOOC, which I used to have to explain in great gory detail to audiences, is now part of how we think about education. The thing that I believe has been overlooked in a lot of public discussion in this area is the extent to which the things that we're talking about this morning have been a seed for innovation. So one of the things I'd like you to carry away from the discussion today are the unexpected aspects of our investment in online education that had nothing to do with the original motivation. That had nothing to do with the headlines of newspaper articles. They were simply seeds for great ideas that probably would not have occurred in that time frame without them. So in a sense, I'm in this book trying to chronicle a time when an old way of thinking became obsolete. And then what do we shift to? What do we pivot to as a result of that? And let me begin with just a real quick story. In 2011, the same time my first book was published, Abelard to Apple, I was teaching a MOOC. It was called a MOOC. It was a MOOC that was being managed by George Siemens at Athabasca University in British Columbia, the Canadian online university, and we had enrolled the staggering class of 1,500 students, and we were going to offer this course over 33 weeks. This was exactly at the same time that I got an email from Sebastian Thrun. One of the famous emails that he sent out that said, "Come and join my artificial intelligence course at Stanford." And I watched, like the rest of the world, the enrollments climb to 150,000 students. And because I was looking at 1,500 students and 150,000 students, I kind of rocked back on my heels and said, I didn't see that one coming. But it was clear that there were things going on that were different. When Sebastian resigned his position at Stanford, I was in Silicon Valley. I was giving an Authors at Google talk. And the day before my talk, someone said, "Have you looked at Khan Academy?" And I didn't really know what Khan Academy was, but I went back to my hotel room and I looked at it. And I happened to pick up a lecture from Khan Academy on a topic called the mean value theorem. Doesn't matter what it is. It's a piece of calculus. The mean value theorem. And it just was something that connected with me. And so I watched this 10-minute gem from Sal Khan to explain the mean value theorem. And I thought, well, what's the best lecture I've seen on the mean value theorem in a traditional classroom? Happened to be an MIT OpenCourseware course. So I went to that course and watched the lecture again. 50 minutes. 50 minutes of review, of administration, of reminding students that their homework is due, of cleaning up questions from last time. I counted 33 new ideas that were kind of flooding the student's mind during that lecture in the traditional format. Sal Khan's 10-minute video had one idea. It was the mean value theorem. And it just struck me that this was a way of teaching that I had never seen before. And I wondered what that would look like in a technologically enabled world. And in Revolution, I talk about this episode. And the phrase that kept coming to mind was the tyranny of content. When we structure a syllabus in the bricks and mortar world of education, we lay out in a calendar form what topics are going to be taught. We say nothing at all about what topics are going to be learned. So we make this content the king of how we guide students through the academic year. What if we turned that around? What if we made content? What if we made learning king and let time be variable? This is a theme that you hear over and over again for people who come to the realization that there's a different way of doing things. That wasn't the point where I realized that a revolution had occurred. This was. So I have a colleague named Ferry, Professor Ferry, and this is a photograph taken by her son, sitting in a Georgia Tech class. Jason is sitting there watching a lecture, an engineering lecture, and he looks down at the student in front of him. And he sees that the student is watching a video of his mother. Professor Ferry is on that laptop. That's not Professor Ferry in the front of the room. Jason Ferry is watching his mother teach another student in a physical classroom in a virtual way at the same time that an oblivious lecturer at the front of the room is talking with his back to the audience. And it just struck me at that point that was a tipping point. When you have this kind of mixture of technology and physical presence, these are the kinds of situations that you get into. So describing all of this, describing what's happened, isn't easy. Since Abelard was published, there have been dozens of books published on disruption in higher education. A lot of them are written by outsiders. They say you have to throw away the whole system because it's being done wrong. A lot of them are valedictories written by college presidents that describe their legacies. But I didn't find in this whole collection of material very much useful information about how all this is done. How do you get to the point where the paradigm actually does shift? And I bring this up because if you pay attention, you find that most of what's written about higher education is not very encouraging. I mean, we saw Todd's slides a few minutes ago. You see where the trends are heading. And it's very easy to get lost in this idea that things are just going to hell in a handbasket, that the end is near. And I'm talking this morning to you about the alternative view, that when you shift a paradigm, you make the things that were unacceptable about the old way of doing business obsolete and substitute something new. So what's wrong with the end is near? What's wrong with the end is near, of course, is that The U.S. has constructed the world's best system of higher education. By any measure you want to choose, the best universities in the world come from North America. Now here's the SJT ranking of top 10 universities. And except for Cambridge and Oxford, they're all American universities. How can things be bad if of the top 100 universities in the world by anyone's ranking, half of them are American universities or North American universities? And the answer, of course, is that we have done this, but we've done it in the most extraordinarily expensive way possible. I point out that there aren't 10 universities in the United States. There are about 4,500. And in fact, if you take the Department of Education figures, it's probably closer to 7,000. We have a lot of colleges and universities in the United States. So to make a blanket statement about the entire system on the basis of this 10 universities or 40 universities doesn't make a lot of sense, because the critics have a point. Tuition has rapidly outpaced growth in income. It used to be that the only thing that tracked the increase in tuition was the growth in income of the top 1% of wage earners in the U.S. But even that has tailed off. And everyone who looks at this, I think, with any degree of objectivity, is alarmed by the wedge, by the social wedge that's being driven between what college costs and what the American public can pay for it. Todd mentioned debt. We don't know to what extent the debt problem is a bubble. We don't know the extent to which the debt problem imperils the economy, but it has passed $1 trillion. It's second only to mortgage debt as a source of indebtedness. And every student who signs a loan agreement is caught up in this bet that somehow that loan is going to be repaid in the value of the degree that they earn. The disconnect, we all see the disconnect. The public perception of the value of a college degree for the last 5 years has been that it's a fair to poor bet. And that's less discouraging to me than the right-hand side of that slide, which is that the college president's perception of value is the opposite. The college president's perception of value is that college is a good to excellent bet. So if you wrap all this together and you use the word revolution, this is probably what you have in mind. That you have people storming the gates, that there's going to be an overthrowing of the old order, and that has not occurred. And there are a lot of reasons why it hasn't occurred. I guess the main reason is that there is no impending cliff for higher education. This is not the housing crisis. This is not the housing bubble. There is no economic cliff that higher education is going to fall off of. But that doesn't mean that those problems that I talked about don't remain. This is the revolution. So the revolution is a relatively small group of people that have decided to experiment with what it means to be a college or a university. This is something that in Abelard to Apple I talked about as being unique to the 19th century, that you saw the explosion of experimentation in American higher education when the number of colleges and universities went from the dozens to the thousands. All of that experimentation. Take away the poor cousins of Oxford and Cambridge, and almost everything that happened in the 19th century was an experiment in what it meant to be a college and university. So when I say revolution, what I don't mean is the French Revolution. What I mean is something more like the Thomas Kuhn Revolution. It's a paradigm shift. It's a point at which how we talk about things changes. It's a point at which our vocabulary changes. It's a point at which old models become inoperative for some other reason and new models come into play. It's not the only paradigm shift, obviously. There have been dozens of paradigm shifts. The whole internet revolution was a paradigm shift. And these things happen very quickly. Thomas Kuhn, when he talked about revolutions in science, was talking about generational changes. We are now down to product life cycle changes that revolutionize markets and revolutionize industries. See if we can get this to work. No, we can't. Okay, we'll do without the videos. So it's easy to find examples of paradigm shifts that crept up on us. I have in my files memos from senior executives at Montgomery Wards, dated 1997, in which vice presidents of, everybody remembers Montgomery Wards? For 130 years, the largest retailer in the country. They sold everything from houses to automobiles to hosiery. In 1997, executives at Montgomery Wards were arguing that consumers loved their company so much that they would get into a cold car on a snowy Minnesota night and drive to the store to return a toaster. And they were writing these memos at exactly the same time that Amazon was building out the world's largest department store and investing exactly the same amount of money. By year 2000, Montgomery Wards had disappeared. That was a paradigm shift that took less than 5 years to complete. And what we're seeing today is this speed accelerating. So here's what we have in mind when we think of college. A small college experience. The professor interacting with his students. I think 1, 2, 3, 5 students I can see in that picture. That's what college catalogs show us. That's the small college experience that people who are nostalgic for college want us to think about. This is the college experience. This is what students today experience. This is what you pay $40,000 for at the University of Colorado. It's what you pay $50,000 for at Harvard. It's a very different experience. It's a mass production experience. It's a factory model of higher education. So when we talk about paradigm shifts, we're talking about a paradigm shift that involves this version of higher education. And by the way, I'm all in for the small classroom experience. I love the small classroom experience, but it's also stunningly obvious that the small classroom experience only helps you if you're in the small classroom. And how do we afford that? Well, we don't. We put a few people in a small classroom and we put the rest of them in a football stadium. So one way to approach this problem, it's the way that we started at Georgia Tech, is to think about making classrooms less like factories and more like the brain actually learns. Well, how does the brain learn? The brain learns not by being washed over 50 minutes at a time by someone's inspired lecture. The brain learns in small steps. The brain learns in a stimulus reinforcement process that begins in neurons. Everyone who's taken a course in public speaking knows that the secret to giving a good speech is levity, brevity, and repetition. Let me repeat that. The point is that everyone realizes that you get an audience's attention by redirecting their attention. And then reinforcing that over and over again until short-term memory gets transferred into long-term memory. This is not simply knowledge acquisition. This is not simply skill acquisition. This is every learning process goes through this kind of method. This is not what we do in a traditional classroom. It's not what we do in a 500-person lecture hall. It's also been known for a long time that if you want to organize a classroom, you should organize a classroom into small segments of content with embedded assessments and use that as the gating factor for how students progress through the course. Benjamin Bloom knew this in 1983 when he published his paper, The 2 Sigma Problem. The 2 Sigma Problem says if you want to organize a classroom in a way that moves everyone in the class 2 standard deviations when measured against standardized tests, that's how you should do it. And there's a phrase at the end of his paper which always struck me as kind of a plaintive cry. He says, but no one can afford this. No one can afford to organize a classroom in this way. So it occurred to me that as we were watching the first generation of MOOCs roll out, that technology has done for the 2 Sigma problem what technology has done for so many aspects of society. It's disrupted the normal mode of operation and enabled something that wouldn't have been possible without it. We were an early adopter of MOOCs. The Georgia Tech MOOCs were extraordinarily popular. We went from an enrollment of 0 to 1.5 million enrollees in Coursera and Udacity within a space of a few months. To be honest, we didn't know what we were doing when we started out. I had promised the university that I would not use state funds to build these assets, so I went out and raised private dollars to be able to build this capability. But the idea was that we would build a set of assets that we could use to experiment with making classrooms more like the brain likes to learn. And so the MOOCs that we offered initially were never the end goal. The end goal was always to use them as assets for blended learning, for flipping classrooms, for reaching out to students that needed the acceleration in order to succeed at Georgia Tech. Todd mentioned big data. Let me make an aside on big data here. At the same time we were doing this with MOOCs, my colleague down the street at Georgia State University was looking at millions of student records and making essentially the same observation. With what we know about how people learn, can we improve student success rates? And he was concerned with the length of time that students were paying tuition at Georgia State. And so this is the kind of data that he came up with. If you take a look at a chemistry major, it's not surprising that chemistry majors who get A's and B's in their first chemistry course overwhelmingly complete their degrees on time. That's what those percentages recommend. We all thought that if you get a C in your first chemistry course, it decreased your chances a little bit of completing on time. What we didn't anticipate was what Tim Rennick found when he actually looked at the data, that if you get a C in your first chemistry course, the odds are against you completing your degree on time. For political science majors, the situation is even worse. For music theorists, it's even worse. So the question is, when in that freshman year did the instructor know that chemistry major was going to get a C? Was it when she missed 2 lectures in a row? Was it when there was a homework assignment missed? Was it when you got a C or a D on a midterm exam? When did you know this? And they developed a set of flags. They developed a set of warning flags that they could build into their learning management system that would allow instructors to press a button when one of those flags was observed. That button triggers an email to the student and to an advisor. They get together and decide either that the student had better think about a different major, or that there's some missing metacognitive skill, or that there's something that can be done to improve the student's chances of success. Over the last 5 years, on the average, Georgia State has taken 2 years, 3 semesters, off the average graduation number of credits for their students as a result of looking at big data. Now, what you find is that in the University Innovation Alliance, this idea of predictive analytics as being predictive of student success has become embedded in the way that they operate, to the extent that at places like Georgia State, you see budgeting take place because they know the return on investment in hiring that new advisor. Speaking of building things into your normal mode of operation, the person who succeeded me as the Dean of the College of Computing at Georgia Tech took a look at our success rates for free MOOCs and said, maybe we can offer our master's program much more efficiently in a much more cost-effective way by using this delivery vehicle. Now, notice that a master's degree is not being offered to an 18-year-old high school graduate. It's being offered to a slightly older student. So we launched in 2013 our online masters in computer science. The courses were built with a generous gift from AT&T. Udacity was the MOOC platform to do it. The innovation here was that we built the price of this degree from the ground up. The cost of offering this degree is about $4,700. We built a generous margin of error into it and offered the degree for $6,700. This is for a $40,000 degree. And we had enough confidence in the mode of instruction that we were looking at mastery learning, we were looking at attacking the 2 sigma problem so that it would carry the Georgia Tech seal, maybe one of the top 5 master's degrees in the country, would be indistinguishable whether you had sat in a classroom or taken the courses online. So last spring, we had enrolled 3,300 students in this program. This year, we're looking at 4,000 students in the program. We've graduated the first cohort of students. And here's the unexpected thing. When I talked about innovation, here's what I'm talking about. Here's the unexpected thing. I believed everyone who was involved in the creation of this degree believed that it was a competitive play against our peer institutions, that we would be stealing students from other master's degrees. In fact, that didn't happen. Joshua Goodman at Harvard has just completed a study in which he does the projections of the impact of this degree. Here's the bottom line of this degree. This degree expanded national capacity for graduate education in computer science by 8%. Think about that. A single degree by a single university in its first offering projected to expand capacity by 8%. These are people who would not have had access to graduate education in computer science. Where did they come from? They came from Central Valley of California. What's in the Central Valley of California? IT manufacturing companies, filled with engineers, with families, with mortgages who are simply not going to pick up stakes and move to Oakland so that they can get their master's degree at Berkeley. And when a $6,700 master's degree carrying a brand name university seal on it came along, they jumped at it. Over 10 years, this program will have doubled national capacity for graduate education in computer science. And we are now actively engaged at taking a look at all of our master's programs and converting those that make sense into this format. And you will see over the course of the next few months announcements about other versions of this program. Innovation, there's too many inventions that came out of these programs to make the entire catalog. Let me mention a couple that strike me as especially noteworthy because they didn't occur to me at the time. This fellow, Mike Schatz, teaches Physics 101 in MOOC format. It is the Georgia Tech Introduction to Physics course. The wrap on laboratory sciences using MOOC format is the laboratory. How do you recreate the laboratory? Those of you who remember your freshman, sophomore natural science courses, remember going down to the basement of some classroom building, hooking up sparking batteries in a dusty old lab someplace and conducting experiments. Schatz didn't believe that experience could be recreated online. But what he did believe was that there was another way of looking at a physics laboratory that no one had thought of before. And so he subtitles his course, "The World is Your Laboratory." And here is the laboratory for the module on the equation of motion of a body freely falling in a gravitational field. It's a person shooting a basketball. He sends his students out to shoot basketballs. And because every student carries a smartphone with a camera, they can record each other shooting basketballs. Those videos are uploaded to a server that are provided along with the course. They're processed, sent back to the student in the form of a clickable file, and the student can click, click, click along the trajectory of the basketball, vary the angle of release, vary the velocity of release, and as a result derive the equation of motion in much the same way that you would in a physical laboratory. Todd mentioned AI, so let me mention AI here. We have a professor in our online masters in computer science who teaches an artificial intelligence course. If you've been listening carefully, artificial intelligence is kind of a theme here. What is different about this course is that it's the online version of the course. It's the MOOC version of the course, and it needs teaching assistants in order to operate. So Ashok Goyal, who's the professor in this course, because he has a special relationship with MIT, was able to snag a license to IBM's Watson, the Watson that won Jeopardy, and he created an AI teaching assistant called Jill Watson. So Jill Watson was among 10 teaching assistants in this class. And he spent maybe a semester or so training Jill on the class. But he didn't tell the students that he was introducing an AI as one of the teaching. He wanted to see whether or not the students would figure this out on their own. There's this thing called the Turing test. The Turing test is that you have an artificial intelligence when a human observer can't determine whether or not they're speaking to an artificial intelligence or a human intelligence. So this is the first known instance of passing the Turing test, because the students, the 500 students that were taking this course, couldn't tell. And we know they couldn't tell because they post their discussion groups online on Google+. You can go on Google+, search for OMSCS, and see the entire history of this operation. There are a few students towards the end of the semester that say, I wouldn't put it past Professor Goyal to throw this at us. But at the end of the semester, the students didn't know. And the fact is that Jill Watson performed at least as well as the human teaching assistants. It's another kind of innovation. So if you were thinking about what does it take to scale up a kind of contact that human students value, this is the kind of invention that you'll be looking at. So I said at the start, I sometimes think that I'm living in two separate worlds. I see the discussions online about, as you see there, professors pushing back against MOOCs, faculty resistance to MOOCs, to all the reasons that this is a bad idea. I have to say that our experience is exactly the opposite of this. And in fact, I wanted to show you this because this is an email written by one of our professors, a MOOC instructor, who was initially not in favor of this idea, did not think it was a good idea for the reasons that you might guess. This professor thought that the experience for students would be cold and distant and impersonal. And after a semester's teaching in the OMSCS program, here was the email that we got. So the concern about having no contact with the instructor was not only wrong, it was exactly wrong. There was more contact. There was more interaction. There was more feeling of involvement and participation between the professor and the students than in the traditional experience. And this shows up in all of the data. So, for example, the retention rate for our online masters is about 90%. We come nowhere near that in the bricks and mortar program. Every place that you choose to look for the efficacy of the program, you find that it's a positive experience. So let me turn just for a second to the future. My thesis is that this revolution has washed over us, that we're already in the middle of it. You already see institutions around the country picking off pieces of this problem, not necessarily MOOC-based programs, but maybe like Georgia State using big data, maybe like Southern New Hampshire using technology-enabled competency-based education. Wherever you look, you see people picking off pieces of this problem. And one of the reasons that this gets your attention is that it addresses one of the main cost drivers in higher education, which is the extraordinarily high cost of transmitting information. Once you've made that problem more manageable, then you can look at the future and think about what are the 21st century skills you're going to take. So when I look at institutions that are taking risks, that are experimenting in this area, what I have in mind is a place that maybe not many of you have heard of, University of Fort Hare. Has anybody heard of the University of Fort Hare? University of Fort Hare is a little tiny university in southern Africa. The amazing thing about this university is that virtually every political leader on the African continent spent time at the University of Fort Hare. Desmond Tutu, Nelson Mandela, everyone that you think about as being a leader in moving the entire continent found themselves at this university. And so what does it take to rebuild the kinds of leadership cultures, the kinds of learning experiences that are going to cause people to grow like that in the future? You never have time to figure it out if what you're doing is filling and heating large lecture halls. And I guess the end of this part of the story is that our plan is to do exactly that. Our plan is to use technology as a tool for taking what a university does best and projecting that onto our students, and not spending a lot of money, not spending a lot of effort on things that can be easily commoditized. As I was preparing for the last book, one of the interviewees was John Hennessy, president of Stanford University. And my inspiration for this idea was an offhand remark that Hennessy made about what Stanford's secret sauce was. And the way John explained it was that whatever Stanford does, the skills that it imparts don't peak until 10 years or more after graduation. So how do you build that kind of deliberately developmental individual into a system that's aimed at standardized tests, aimed at summative testing, aimed at quantitative assessment? You have to look more deeply, just as we looked in the development of the first MOOCs, into how people grow, how they establish views of themselves as growing individuals over the course of their career. And you can see this at many different institutions. I think this is the next wave that we're looking for. So let me finish by answering a question that a lot of people ask about this whole topic. How do you do this? How do you take a rather conservative engineering school and move it so dramatically in a different direction? And I have to say that my inspiration for doing this has always been Buckminster Fuller. If you go to Buckminster Fuller's gravesite in Cambridge, you see on his headstone, "Call me trim tab." Who knows what a trim tab is? Good. So a trim tab is a small piece of metal on the edge of a rudder of an ocean-going ship, for example. How do you turn the direction of a large ocean liner? Do you push on the bow of the ship to try to turn it? No, you tire yourself out and the ship won't turn very much. So what you do is move a small piece of metal on the edge of the rudder, which takes almost no energy at all to move. But once you move that small piece of metal, it creates a region of low pressure. And because the ship is moving with such momentum in one direction, that region of low pressure grows. And it grows so quickly that it draws the rudder in. The rudder turns and the ship turns. What's the moral that you draw from that story? The moral you draw from that story is, if you want to affect change at your institutions, you should look for the trim tabs. You should look for the people that can create small projects. Small, non-threatening projects would be even better. That if they're successful, have large implications for the organization. So when we signed our agreement with Coursera in 2012, I had no idea that Zvi Galil was going to sign an agreement with Udacity for an online master's in computer science. But that first set of courses with Coursera was the trim tab. It was the thing that drew the entire institution in. It drew us into the kinds of innovations that I talked about this morning. So let me finish just by, again, with Buckminster Fuller, by reiterating what I said at the start of this talk. This idea of revolution is very, very tricky. If you think about the revolution as pushing against the bow of the ship, it's not going to be successful. You're going to get resistance, and nothing much will happen. But if you think about finding the trim tabs, finding the small projects, finding the things that, if they succeed, have large implications for your organization, then you have a chance of doing what Bucky Fuller says. Not by changing the existing reality. Just build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. And then the ocean liner will turn. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Rich. It's awesome. We got a little something for you here to thank you for just a speaker gift. It's a local artist.
Oh, great.
Who, and obviously the horses, you get the reference. We're known for our horses.
Yeah, yeah.
Awesome. That was wonderful. So much to
thank you,
think about. It's a great way to start the conference.
Good. Thank you.
Thanks, Rich.